Let me ask you something. Is economic inequality actually bad for our minds? I mean, it's a belief that's so widespread, it pretty much feels like a fact, right? But what if that whole story we've been told is built on, well, an illusion?
And look, this isn't some fringe idea we're talking about. You've got huge global organizations, the UN, the World Health Organization, all citing this. And let's be honest, for a lot of us, it just feels true, doesn't it? The wider that gap gets between the rich and the poor, the more stressed, the more anxious, and yeah, the more unhappy we all become.
But here's the thing. What if that gut feeling, that whole dominant story, was built on a really shaky foundation? Well, today, we are going to unpack a truly landmark study that put this exact idea to the ultimate test. So the big question is, when scientists finally looked at all the evidence, what did they actually find?
All right, so first, let's just quickly break down the story we've all heard, because this isn't just some vague feeling people have. Oh no, there's a very specific psychological theory behind why inequality is supposed to be so bad for us.
Okay, so the theory goes something like this. The more unequal a society is, the more we're all constantly aware of where we stand on the economic ladder, right? This supposedly creates this, this cutthroat culture of competition. It dials up our status anxiety, it wears away at our friendships and social bonds, and the end results of all that? Worse well-being and a lot more mental health problems. It's a really compelling story, you have to admit.
So, the question is, how on earth do you definitively test a huge idea like that? Well, you conduct what's basically the scientific version of a Supreme Court hearing. It's called a meta-analysis. You gather up every single relevant study ever done on the topic to try and reach a final binding verdict. And guess what? That is exactly what happened here. And we're not talking about a handful of studies. No. This was a systematic review of a staggering 168 separate pieces of research. We're talking about work published over 2 entire decades. I mean, the scale here is it's massive.
And these weren't tiny little studies either. In total, all this data represents the actual lives of over 11 million people all around the world. So let's be super clear. This isn't just another study. It is, by far, the most authoritative investigation into this question that has ever been done. Period.
So, what did they find? What's the verdict? Well, at first glance, for what we call subjective well-being, stuff like happiness, life satisfaction, the researchers found no significant link to inequality. Nada. Zero. But for mental health, they did find something, a small but statistically significant negative link. Basically, the more unequal the place, the slightly worse the mental health. So, case closed, right? The story is true. Well, not so fast.
And this right here is where the story takes a really fascinating plot twist. Because that initial finding, the one that seemed to confirm what everyone already believed, well, it was hiding a massive flaw, not in the study, but in the scientific literature itself.
This flaw has a name. It's called publication bias, and it's a huge deal in science. Let me explain it this way. Imagine a bunch of scientists are flipping a coin 100 times. You'd expect about 50 heads and 50 tails, right? Okay, but what if they only bothered to publish the results when they got heads? If you just read the published papers, you'd think that coin flips always come up heads. That, in a nutshell, is publication bias. See, in science, studies that find a surprising link, any link, are just seen as more exciting. They're way more likely to get published than boring old studies that find nothing at all.
So here's the really brilliant part. This is what the researchers did next. They started with that small negative link they found. Then they ran these really sophisticated statistical tests that are designed to sniff out this exact kind of bias. And what happened? Well, once they corrected the data, once they accounted for all those unpublished heads flips that were just sitting in a file drawer somewhere, the link between inequality and mental health, it just vanished completely. Yeah, you heard that right. That supposed connection, the one we've all been talking about for years, between economic inequality and mental health problems for the general population, it wasn't a real thing. It was a statistical ghost, an illusion that was created by decades of biased reporting in the scientific record.
But wait, the story doesn't actually end there, because just saying inequality has no effect is way too simple. It's not the whole picture. So the researchers, they dug even deeper. They asked a super important question. Are there specific situations, specific contexts, where inequality really does cause harm? And the answer, it turns out, is a definite yes.
Okay, so the first key context is a big one, your income. When the researchers split up the data, they found something fascinating. That negative link between inequality and poor mental health, it only existed for people in low-income groups. For everybody else, for people with higher incomes,
There was just no significant effect. And that tells us something really important. Inequality isn't some kind of universal poison that affects everyone the same way. No, its sting is felt most sharply by the people who have the fewest resources to begin with.
Now, the second context is even more surprising, if you can believe it. It's inflation. Check this out. In times of low inflation, the study found that higher inequality was actually linked to better well-being. It's like people looked at the gap and saw it as a sign of opportunity, like a ladder they could climb. But in times of high inflation, the whole thing completely flips on its head. Suddenly, higher inequality is linked to worse well-being. The system doesn't feel like a ladder anymore. It feels rigged. It feels unfair. The economic climate, it seems, completely changes the lens through which we see the world.
So, after all that, what's the big takeaway? What does this all mean for us? Well, this research does more than just debunk a myth. It actually gives us a much, much sharper map for how to build a psychologically healthier society. And it suggests that maybe, just maybe, we need to shift our focus a little.
Here's the bottom line. Inequality itself might not be the direct poison we thought it was. It's more like a catalyst. It takes real-world problems, like struggling with poverty or dealing with economic instability, and it makes them feel so much worse. So what does that mean? It means that policies that directly attack poverty are absolutely critical for mental health. And get this, it also suggests that keeping inflation under control, well, that isn't just some dry economic goal. You could actually see it as a public mental health policy.
So at the end of the day, this research fundamentally challenges that simple story we've all been told for so long.
The evidence really suggests the real story is way more nuanced than just rich versus poor. And that leaves us with one final, and I think pretty provocative question to think about. If the harm of inequality is felt most by the poorest among us, and it gets cranked up to 11 by economic instability, have we been aiming at the wrong target all this time? Maybe our focus shouldn't be so much on closing the gap, but on raising the floor for every single person.